People hold the power. People across the United States are standing up against the Trump regime, standing up against ICE as it disappears people in our cities, in our communities, in our schools, in our country. It is unacceptable. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Truth, the sanctuary for straight talk in a world that seems to be perpetually tiptoeing around the point. I'm your host, and today we're diving headfirst into a situation where it seems the best-laid plans of mice and certain political figures have gone spectacularly awry. We're talking about the reported backfiring of a significant Trump-affiliated immigration operation, a story highlighted with no small amount of dramatic flair by outlets like MeidasTouch, who famously declared, "All hell breaks loose." To help us unpack this masterclass in unintended consequences, we have our esteemed guest back with us. Welcome.
A pleasure to be here, and masterclass in unintended consequences, well, is putting it mildly. It seems some folks are just determined to learn their lessons the hard way, preferably in the full glare of the public spotlight.
Indeed. So let's set the stage for our listeners. This operation, what was it supposed to be? What were the grand designs, the whispered objectives, before it all reportedly went pear-shaped?
The grand designs. If one were to piece together the typical rhetoric and the usual preemptive victory laps, this operation was designed to be a shock and awe campaign, the kind that screams, "We're in control, we're tough," and, of course, look over here, not at those other inconvenient things. We're talking about high-profile immigration enforcement actions, likely intended to sow fear, secure the base, and perhaps generate some intimidating headlines. The objective, presumably, was to project an image of unshakable resolve, a firm hand on the tiller of national security, if you will. You know, the standard playbook. Flex a muscle, round up some folks, and hope it scares everyone else into whatever the desired state of subdued compliance is.
So a display of power, essentially. Not. But the narrative we're seeing, particularly from sources like MeidasTouch, isn't one of power successfully projected, but of an operation backfiring and communities actively fighting back. Can you elaborate on what exactly went wrong for the architects of this plan? Where did the script deviate so dramatically?
Well, the script deviated the moment it encountered reality, which is often a stubborn and uncooperative character in these political dramas. The fundamental flaw, it seems, was underestimating the intelligence and resilience of ordinary people. It's one thing to sit in an echo chamber and convince yourself that a bit of bluster will send everyone scurrying. It's quite another to enact that bluster on communities that are, shall we say, rather tired of being used as political props. You see, when these operations hit the ground, they weren't met with the silent, quivering fear that might have been anticipated in some strategy rooms. Scoff slightly. Instead, as reports like the one concerning Milford highlight, people organized, communities talked, legal aid groups mobilized, neighbors looked out for neighbors. It's almost as if, and I know this is a radical concept for some, people don't enjoy seeing their communities turned into theaters for political posturing. The backfire wasn't just a misstep, it was a full-blown public repudiation. They expected sheep, and they found, well, not sheep, more like well-organized, highly articulate porcupines.
That's a vivid image. Could you give us a more concrete sense of how these communities fought back? What did that resistance look like on the ground? We hear, "all hell breaks loose," but what form did this hell take for the operation's enforcers?
The hell, from their perspective, a slight, almost pitying sigh, was likely the sheer, unadulterated inconvenience of due process and public scrutiny. It took many forms. Firstly, there was rapid information dissemination. In the age of social media and instant communication, word of raids or enforcement actions spreads like wildfire. This allows people to alert each other, to know their rights, which is always a dreadful spanner in the works for those who prefer their targets to be uninformed and isolated. Wry tone. Secondly, legal resistance. Lawyers, bless their argumentative souls, descended to offer counsel, to challenge detentions, to ensure that every I was dotted and every T was crossed. When you're aiming for swift, dramatic impact, the meticulous, slow grind of legal challenges is akin to wading through molasses. Ugh. Thirdly, and perhaps most visibly, was direct community support and presence. This could mean peaceful protests, witnesses documenting actions, community members providing sanctuary or support to affected families. When your operation relies on an element of surprise and the isolation of individuals, a crowd of concerned citizens with smartphones is a significant impediment. It changes the optics dramatically, doesn't it? Instead of a decisive show of force, it starts to look like an overzealous government body clashing with its own people. The hell was that the narrative was wrested from their control almost immediately.
It sounds like a fascinating, almost textbook case of grassroots mobilization overwhelming a top-down directive. What does this say about the current political climate and the effectiveness of using immigration as a wedge issue, especially with such aggressive tactics?
Oh, it says volumes, though whether the intended recipients are listening is another matter entirely. For years, immigration has been the go-to hot-button issue, a reliable way to stir a certain pot. But what this kind of backfire demonstrates is that there might be a diminishing return on pure shock value, especially when it's perceived as cruel or incompetently executed. People are perhaps becoming desensitized to the rhetoric and more sensitized to the human cost. Moreover, these heavy-handed tactics can inadvertently create alliances. Groups that might not have otherwise found common cause suddenly realize they have a shared interest in opposing what they see as governmental overreach or injustice. So instead of neatly dividing the populace, you risk uniting a surprisingly broad coalition against you. It's like trying to put out a small fire with a gallon of gasoline. Makes a whoosh sound followed by a small explosive poof sound with his mouth. The initial whoosh might look impressive, but the subsequent infernum is rarely what was intended. The political calculus that assumes tough on immigration equals easy win is looking increasingly like outdated software running on a very old, very glitchy computer.
You mentioned the architects of this operation. What kind of political fallout are they facing? Is this something that can be spun away, or does an operational failure of this visibility leave a more lasting mark?
The spin doctors are undoubtedly earning their exorbitant fees as we speak. We'll hear the usual refrains. The operation was a success, but the liberal media won't tell you, or we were undermined by insert convenient scapegoat here. Perhaps they'll even try to gaslight everyone into believing that this chaos was, in fact, the intended outcome, a sort of 4D chess move that the rest of us are, mockingly, too simple to comprehend. However, there's a limit to what spin can achieve, especially when there are tangible reports and, crucially, visuals of communities successfully resisting. Mud sticks. And the particular brand of mud that comes from a public faceplant, an operation that not only failed but also made you look a bit like a bully who got stood up to by the entire schoolyard, a short, sharp laugh, is particularly hard to wash off. It erodes credibility, not just with the general public, but potentially even within their own ranks. Nobody likes to be associated with a fiasco. Pauses. It raises questions about competence, strategy, and ultimately leadership. So yes, while the immediate narrative will be fiercely contested, the underlying aroma of failure tends to linger. Sniffs theatrically.
It's a compelling narrative of David versus Goliath in a way. If David was a well-informed community with access to legal aid and smartphones. Looking forward, do you think incidents like this will lead to a change in tactics from those who favor such operations, or will they simply double down?
The eternal question, learn or double down? History, especially recent political history, suggests that doubling down is often the path of least intellectual resistance. Slightly cynical tone. It requires less introspection, less admission of error. So we might see attempts to refine the tactics, perhaps more surprise, less telegraphing of moves, or attempts to target areas perceived as less organized. However, they also face a problem. The more these things backfire, the more communities learn, the more prepared they become. Each failed operation serves as a live-action training exercise for those who would resist the next one. They might also try to shift the blame, to legislate away the very rights and avenues that enable such resistance. That's always a popular go-to for those frustrated by pesky things like due process. But one hopes, perhaps foolishly, that at some point the sheer inefficiency and the negative PR generated by these backfires might lead to a quiet reassessment. Or, more likely, they'll just find a new, different rake to step on. The capacity for self-inflicted political injury, after all, seems to be a bottomless well for some.
A sobering yet characteristically sharp prediction. It seems the saga of immigration politics will continue to provide ample material for discussion and for displays of both institutional power and community resilience. Thank you so much for sharing your detailed insights and your, shall we say, unfiltered perspective with us today.
The pleasure, as always, was all mine. It's important to keep shining a light on these things, lest they become normalized in the shadows.
And that's all the time we have for today on The Unfiltered Truth. Join us next time as we continue to peel back the layers and get to the heart of the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and don't be afraid to question the script.